She was 39 years old, and by the winter of 1889 she had nothing left of her name but a canvas satchel, a wool cloak patched twice at the hem, and $3 sewn into the lining of her glove. Her name was Vesta Cole, and it was a river town's own council, led by a merchant named Horace Pell who had bought up half the waterfront and wanted the rest, that had quietly forced the closure of the small ferry line she and her late father had run for 11 years, declaring her single aging vessel unfit for the crossing, and leaving her with no income and no standing in the town of Millhaven, Minnesota. She took the little she had and went to the county auction, where the old ferry dock at the river's bend, rotting and listing badly into the current, unused since the ferry line's closure, was being sold because the county wanted the land cleared for a new bridge crossing. Nobody bid on it. She raised her hand and offered $3, and the men gathered at the riverbank laughed and said she had bought the one thing in Millhaven even the river itself seemed to want rid of. What none of them knew, what Vesta herself did not yet know as she walked out onto those groaning planks for the first time, was that beneath the ice forming along the dock's old pilings lay something that had been waiting a decade to be found, something that would not only save her from ruin but would return to the whole town of Millhaven a truth it had spent 10 years trying to forget. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Vesta Cole. If you have ever been told that the thing you built with your own hands was no longer wanted, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Vesta had been born on that same river in 1850, the only child of a ferryman named Ambrose Cole, a broad, weathered man who had run boats across the Minnesota River since before Millhaven had a proper name, back when it was little more than a trading post and a scattering of cabins clinging to the bluff above the water. Ambrose raised Vesta alone after her mother died of fever when she was only 4, and rather than send her away to relatives in St. Paul as some in the town suggested would be more proper, he kept her with him on the water, teaching her, as soon as she was old enough to grip an oar, the particular discipline that a river demands of anyone who means to work it honestly. She learned to read the current the way other children learn their letters, learned to judge the difference between a safe crossing and a dangerous one by nothing more than the color of the water and the pull of it against the hull, learned to listen for the low groan of ice beginning to shift beneath the boat in the earliest days of winter, a sound her father said would save her life someday if she paid it proper attention. Ambrose was not a wealthy man, but he was known up and down that stretch of river as an honest one, a ferryman who never overcharged a family traveling with nothing, who never once in 30 years lost a passenger to the water, and who believed, and taught his daughter to believe, that the river belonged to everyone who needed to cross it, not merely to those who could afford to. It was this belief that shaped the whole of Vesta's early life, for Millhaven in those years was a town built on the uneasy cooperation of many small interests, farmers and millers and traders, all dependent on that one river crossing to move their goods and themselves between the fertile land on the eastern bank and the growing rail depot on the western side. The ferry that Ambrose Cole ran was not the only way across, for a wealthier operator named Silas Pell, Horace Pell's own father, had for a time run a competing service further upriver, but Silas Pell's ferry had always charged considerably more, and it was widely understood among the poorer families of the valley that Ambrose Cole crossing was the one a body could count on when money was thin. Vesta grew into a role in the water as naturally as breathing, and by the time she was 16 she could pole the ferry across in a rising current as capably as her father, a fact that both delighted Ambrose and worried her aunt, who continued to insist, without much effect, that a young woman had no business making her living on a boat. She never married, not for any lack of suitors in her younger years, but because the rhythm of the river and her father's aging health left little room in her life for anything else, and by the time she reached her 30s, she had settled comfortably enough into the identity of the ferryman's daughter who had, in all but title, become the ferryman herself. Ambrose Cole died in 1884, peacefully in his sleep after a long illness, and Vesta inherited not only his small boat and dock but the full weight of his responsibility to the valley's families who depended on that crossing. She ran the ferry alone for the next 5 years, charging the same fare rates her father always had, keeping the old boat patched and sound through her own careful maintenance, and owning, slowly, the same reputation for honest, dependable service that had defined her father's whole career. It was during these years that Horace Pell, Silas Pell's son, having inherited his father's competing interests and expanded them considerably into milling and riverside land speculation, began quietly buying up parcels of the waterfront on both sides of the crossing, always with an eye, though he never said so plainly, toward controlling the whole of Millhaven's river trade for himself. He made Vesta an offer for her dock and ferry rights twice in those years, offers she refused both times, not out of stubbornness but because she understood, as her father had taught her that a monopoly on the only affordable crossing would eventually squeeze the valley's poorer families in ways a shared, competitive service never would. Horace Pell did not take her refusals well, though he never said so outright, maintaining always the same cool, patient courtesy that made him difficult to read and, in time, dangerous to underestimate. The autumn of 1889 brought the disaster that undid Vesta's independence entirely, though it did not come, as such disasters so often do, in any dramatic or obvious form. Horace Pell, who by then had gained controlling seat on the county's River Commerce Council through years of careful cultivation of the town's other leading men, arranged for a formal inspection of every vessel operating on that stretch of the river, ostensibly in the interest of public safety following a minor accident involving an unrelated barge upstream. Vesta's boat, though she had maintained it faithfully for 5 years exactly as her father had taught her, was declared unfit for continued service by an inspector who, she later learned, had been hand-selected by Horace Pell himself and compensated generously for his trouble, citing hull damage that Vesta herself, with a lifetime's knowledge of that boat's every board, insisted did not exist in any form the inspector described. She appealed the ruling before the same council Horace Pell now effectively controlled, and was told, with polite and total finality, that the matter had already been settled and that her ferry license was revoked immediately, leaving Horace Pell's own newer, larger ferry service, conveniently already operating a mile downriver, as the valley's only remaining crossing. Vesta lost, in the span of a single autumn month, the whole of her father's life work and her own livelihood alongside it, left with the small dock itself, now useless without a licensed vessel to operate from it, and no meaningful income to speak of. She sold what she could of her father's old boat for scrap lumber and salvage, enough to keep herself through the winter in a small rented room above the mercantile, and it was there, in early December, that she learned the county intended to auction off the old dock itself, the one her father had built with his own hands 40 years before, because the county surveyors had determined that a new iron bridge, financed in no small part by Horace Pell's own considerable donations to the county, commission, would soon span the river at that very bend, and the derelict dock needed to be cleared to make way for the bridge's western footing. Vesta went to that auction less out of any clear plan than out of a stubborn refusal to watch her father's dock be torn down by strangers without at least standing witness to it, and when the auctioneer called for bids and received none, the assembled men murmuring that the rotting structure was worth less than the trouble of its removal, Vesta found herself raising a hand and offering the $3 that constituted nearly everything she had left in the world. The laughter that followed was not unkind exactly, but it was thorough, several of the men remarking that the ferryman's daughter had gone and bought the one piece of Millhaven the river itself seemed determined to reclaim, and Vesta walked away from that auction the owner of a rotting, listing dock that everyone else considered already lost to the current. She walked out onto those groaning planks for the first time on a bitter gray morning in mid-December, the river beginning to skin over with the season's first true ice along its slower edges, and found the dock in worse condition than even she had expected. Several of the outer pilings visibly rotted through at the waterline, the decking soft and treacherous in places where 40 years of weather had worked its way into the old timber. She spent her first days simply assessing what, if anything, could be salvaged, testing each plank and piling with a careful, practice hand, and it was on her third morning, while probing the base of the dock's oldest and most central piling, driven deep into the riverbed by her own grandfather back when the crossing was first established, that her hand found something wedged into the ice forming at the piling's base, something that did not belong to any natural formation of the river. She worked carefully at the ice with a small hatchet, mindful not to damage whatever lay beneath, and after the better part of an hour's patient effort, freed from the frozen shallows a small, heavy strong box, its iron surface pitted with decades of submersion, but it seems, remarkably, still tight enough that the water had never fully breached it. She carried it up to her rented room that same afternoon and worked at its stubborn lock late into the evening by lamplight, and when it finally gave way, she found inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, a bundle of documents, a small quantity of gold coin, and a single folded letter addressed, in handwriting she recognized instantly and with a start of pure disbelief, as her own grandfather's, the very man who had first built that ferry crossing before her father had ever taken it. Over. She read the letter that night with trembling hands, and what it revealed sent the whole of what she thought she understood about her family's history and the town of Millhaven itself into a slow, dizzying reorganization. Her grandfather, a man named Josiah Cole, had established the original ferry crossing not as a private business venture, but under the terms of an old territorial land grant, one that had designated the crossing in a modest surrounding parcel as a permanent public right-of-way, deeded jointly to the founding families of the valley precisely so that no future landowner could ever monopolize a river crossing for private profit. Josiah's letter explained that in the years before his death, a rival landowner, an ambitious man named Ezekiel Pell, Silas Pell's own father and Horace Pell's great-grandfather, had attempted to have that original grant quietly overturned by the Territorial Land Office, arguing that the crossing should revert to private ownership now that the valley had grown prosperous enough to support a paying operation. Josiah had fought that effort for years, gathering signatures and testimony from the valley's founding families to preserve the crossing's protected status, and had succeeded, at a cost of considerable personal expense and no small danger to himself, in securing a final, binding ruling from the territorial authority confirming the crossing's permanent public status in perpetuity. A ruling he had recorded carefully alongside copies of the original grant documents, intending to file the whole matter permanently with the county courthouse. But Josiah had died suddenly of a fall from the very dock he had built, before he ever completed that filing, and his son Ambrose, Vesta's own father, had apparently never known the full extent of what his own father had secured, inheriting only the practical operation of the ferry itself and never learning that its protected status had been formally established and simply never recorded. Vesta sat with that letter long into the night, the strong box open before her on the small table, and understood with a slow, mounting clarity exactly what had happened in the decades since her grandfather's death, and exactly why Horace Pell had worked so patiently and so thoroughly to strip her of her license and clear her dock from the county's records. If Josiah Cole's ruling had never been formally filed, then in the eyes of the county, the crossing had always existed merely by custom and tolerance rather than by binding legal right, leaving it vulnerable to exactly the kind of quiet consolidation Horace Pell had spent years engineering, first through his father's competing ferry, then through his purchases of the surrounding land, and finally through his manipulation of the county's own safety inspection to eliminate her family's operation. Entirely. She understood, too, the deeper implication buried in her grandfather's careful documentation, that the original land grant had never actually permitted the county to sell their dock parcel at all, meaning that Horace Pell's new bridge, financed so generously through his own donations and planned to cross precisely that protected point, might itself be standing on legally contested ground the moment her grandfather's old ruling was properly filed and recognized. It did not take long for word to reach Horace Pell that the ferryman's daughter had been seen digging through old family papers and asking pointed questions at the county land office about territorial grants from the 1840s. He came to see her himself on a cold January afternoon, finding her at the small dock she now owned, and though his manner remained, as always, coolly courteous, there was a new sharpness beneath it that Vesta had not encountered from him before. He suggested, in a tone that struck her as carefully measured, that whatever old family papers she believed she had found were surely of no real legal consequence after so many decades, and that a woman in her position, with no resources and no standing before the county commission, would do well to abandon whatever notion she had formed before she found herself in genuine difficulty. When Vesta did not yield, he grew more direct, informing her plainly that the bridge project was already too far along, too heavily invested in by too many of the county's leading men, for any old paper to meaningfully interfere with it now, and that she would find few allies willing to jeopardize a project that promised the whole town easier passage across the river. Vesta thanked him for his visit with more composure than she entirely felt, and after he left she understood clearly that she had very little time before the bridge's construction would render the entire question moot, whatever the old documents might say. She traveled to the Territorial Archive in St. Paul herself, using nearly the last of her Strongback's gold coin for the journey, and spent 3 days searching through decades of dust-covered land office record before she found, exactly where her grandfather's letter indicated it should be, the original 1847 ruling confirming the Millhaven Crossing's protected public status, filed under the territorial authority but never subsequently recorded at the county level, precisely the oversight Josiah Cole's sudden death had left uncorrected. She returned to Millhaven not alone, having gathered along the way, through careful inquiry, 3 elderly descendants of the valley's other founding families whose ancestors' names appeared alongside her grandfather's on the original petition, families who, once shown the documents, remembered clearly their own parents' stories of the crossing's hard-won protected status and were more than willing to add their voices to Hayes before the county commission. Together they presented their case not as a bitter widow's grievance, but as a matter of settled territorial law simply overlooked by an administrative oversight, supported by original documents, corroborating family testimony, and the unbroken chain of the crossing's continuous public use for over 40 years. The county commission, faced with a properly filed territorial ruling that could not be simply dismissed, and increasingly uneasy at the prospect of having financed a bridge project on land whose ownership was now in genuine legal dispute, ordered a formal review that Horace Pell could neither delay nor quietly redirect. The review confirmed everything Josiah Cole's letter had promised, that the crossing and its immediate parcel had indeed been permanently protected from private sale under territorial law, meaning the county's auction of the Dr. Vesta had, if anything, been entirely proper, while Horace Pell's subsequent purchases of surrounding land and his arrangement of the inspection that had stripped Vesta's ferry license came under considerably harsher scrutiny once investigators began examining exactly how thoroughly he had maneuvered to consolidate control over what the law had always intended to remain a shared public resource. The inspector who had condemned Vesta's boat was found, under formal questioning, to have received payment well beyond any standard fee for his services, and though Horace Pell faced no criminal charge for the arrangement, the public revelation of it, combined with the embarrassing necessity of relocating his nearly finished bridge project to accommodate protected crossing, cost him dearly in both fortune and standing. And within 2 years he had quietly sold off the greater part of his riverfront holdings and departed Millhaven for business interests elsewhere, leaving behind a town considerably less inclined to trust a Pell name than it once had been. Vesta took no particular satisfaction in his downfall, understanding, much as her grandfather and father before her had understood, that the crossing's true value had never been about defeating any one man, but about restoring what had always rightfully belonged to everyone in the valley who needed to cross that river. With the crossing protected status now properly and permanently recorded at the county courthouse, Vesta rebuilt her father's old dock plank by plank, using a portion of her grandfather's recovered gold coin to purchase a sound new vessel, and reopened the ferry service exactly as her father and grandfather before her had run it, fair priced and open to every family in the valley regardless of their means. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began. A woman of 39, stripped of her livelihood and left with $3, buying for that same small sum a rotting dock that the whole town believed the river itself had already claimed. Vesta Cole never forgot the sound of that laughter at the auction, and she never forgot, either, the discipline her father had taught her on the water, that a person who learns to read what lies beneath the surface, whether in a current or in a town's quiet history, will rarely be caught unprepared by what eventually rises. Her grandfather had sealed his proof beneath the ice not out of fear but out of faith that someday whoever inherited that crossing would find it and understand exactly what needed to be set right. And Vesta had honored that faith not by claiming the crossing for her own profit alone, but by restoring to the entire valley the plain, protected right to cross that river freely. A right her own grandfather had fought to secure and had very nearly lost to time and forgetting. What waited beneath the ice did shock the whole of Millhaven, not merely because it revealed one family's hidden legacy, but because it returned to an entire valley of truth about its own founding that had been quietly buried for 40 years, waiting only for someone patient enough to dig through the cold and find it. Thank you for spending this time with Vesta Cole and the town of Millhaven tonight. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that what the world calls worthless so often holds, quietly beneath its surface, exactly what deserves to be recovered. We would love to know, in the comment below, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already given up on. Take care of one another, and take care of the overlooked corners of your own life and history. Until next time, stay close.